the various parts of the world. I won't try to keep track of where everyone is from. For those of you who don't know me, I'm James Walker. I'm the current head of Department of Languages and Linguistics at La Trobe and the director of the Center for Research on Language Diversity. It's my great pleasure to introduce today our speaker, Dr. Lauren Gawne, who's a lecturer in linguistics in the Department of Languages and Linguistics here at La Trobe. Lauren completed her PhD at the University of Melbourne. She's also held positions at Nanyang Technological University, SOAS in London, and for the past few years she's been a David Myers Research Fellow here at La Trobe University. And she's well known on the internet with her blog Superlinguo and her podcast Enthusiasm, which she does with Gretchen McCulloch. So she's an expert in all things online. And so now she's going to talk to us about emoji as digital gesture.
Thank you, James. I'm going to share my screen. I won't pretend I really am particularly smooth an operator of Zoom, just to not talk up my digital credentials as James has done. But I will just drop this down here. I assume someone will somehow let me know if you can't see my screen. This presentation is work that I have done with Gretchen McCulloch. So we have a podcast, but as I'll kind of explain the backstory of this research, we have also been looking at the role of emoji in online communication. And I thought I'd share this work in the department seminar today because I feel like we're suddenly all a lot more conscious of how we're communicating online, what features of online communication we have to use, because for a lot of people, they're suddenly doing a lot more online communication. So thank you for joining us today. I have created a bit.ly link to these slides and I'll tweet them out later as well. But just to let you know that they are available as we go through this. The genesis of the conversation that Gretchen and I had about emoji is that there is a lot of popular public discourse about emoji being some kind of language. And if there's one thing linguists like to do, it's analyze language. And so we were paying attention to this idea that people were thinking of emoji as some kind of language. And with that, you get these different uses of emoji. And there were times where people would have these kind of what we think of as stunt uses of emoji. So very deliberately ponderous. Here we have an example of someone trying to create the words light and heavy. Whereas what people actually do with emoji doesn't appear to fit with this very stunt use of emoji most of the time in terms of the communicative function. Gretchen chose the examples on this slide and I quite like it because Mark Davis is actually works for Unicode, which is the organization that does the encoding of emoji. So what makes emoji particularly interesting as a phenomenon, and maybe something that you have not entirely thought of before, but they are images that exist like fonts. And so the way that fonts are encoded and appear on your screen is because everyone agrees that there is a symbol for example, E. Sorry, I'm just going to check that we don't have anything. Good, I haven't accidentally turned my mic off or anything. We have a symbol for E in the font, and then depending on whether you use Arial or Times New Roman, it will always represent an E, even though the surface representation might look a little bit different. And so you have a code point that means face with tears of joy, and then maybe on Twitter or on your iPhone or on WhatsApp, the face with tears of joy might look a little bit different, but it will always appear as a face with tears of joy because it's encoded in the way that we always expect an E to be an E. And that means that unlike other types of pictures on the internet, they're very easy to send because they're bundled up with the code rather than sent as a separate file. But also they're very integrated into where the words are. You can have the words and the images of emoji very tightly put together in a way that you can't with, say, a GIF, where you have your text and then you add a GIF separate to it. So this makes, in terms of pictorial communication, it makes emoji particularly interesting. And with this in mind, and with the discourse around emoji supposedly being a language, but the way people are using it not necessarily looking linguistic, we started off with two broad questions. Are emoji something we could think of as language? And if not, what are they? Today's department seminar is kind of my telling of this story, I guess. It's based, what I'm talking about today is based on research, as I said, that Gretchen McCulloch and I have been doing. The very chatty kind of backstory version of this research is given in Gretchen's book, Because Internet, and then the more academic, with all the references there for you, version is in an academic article in the journal Language at Internet. Today is my kind of telling of this story. We have an episode of Lingthusiasm about it as well. So if you are the person who's joined us from the UK and you're very tired, I understand. We have talked about this research elsewhere as well. Because there is the published academic paper, today I'm not going to kind of overwhelm you with citations and evidence. I'm just going to tell the general story of this paper. And I think I have quite a few like research publications that have come about in a very kind of meet cute way. But this is definitely one of those very spontaneous and organic collaborations, which I always really enjoy when they kind of come together like this, where, you know, Gretchen was looking at all the different functions that she was noticing emoji had in conversation, and shared an early draft of her work with me. And I went, well, yes, this is like, there's a thing in the gesture literature on emblems that explains this. You should look at that. And, you know, here's some readings, which, you know, is a way of saying, I care about you. I was like, have some academic articles to read. So that started us looking at whether there were some parallels between what people were doing with emoji and what people were doing with gesture. And the more we looked at it, the more we found really good evidence that emoji are filling in written language a similar role to what gesture are filling in spoken language. And that this could help us distinguish emoji from having linguistic properties and instead having more gestural properties. And so this table is a summary of David McNeil's discussion of the difference between the gestures we use with speech and the properties that language has, and kind of go through all four of them very briefly, but there are many words that could be said about them. In terms of language tends to be very hierarchical and analytical, by which we mean we have a set of a phonetic inventory. A set of those arbitrary sounds builds up into words, or and then those words have fixed meanings, and you can look at the composition very clearly. You have the ability to swap out individual sounds to create new words and minimal pairs. You have very clear relationships between individual parts of a sentence, to create the meaning. So that's that hierarchy analytical side of language, whereas gestures tend to be harder to decompose in their meaning, and tend to have what is therefore referred to by McNeill as a more global meaning. So if someone sent you a text like happy birthday with this string of emoji, this is drawn from the very unscientific corpus of looking back through my old text messages. In a message like this, we can see very clearly the string of characters that represents the word happy, the word birthday, and that's also part of that combinatoric feature of language. Whereas there's nothing about any of those individual emoji that single-handedly and individually represents the general feeling of birthdayness in the way that they all do when they're combined. In terms of that non-combinatoricness, we can't have birthday happy, but it wouldn't be a less valid string of emoji if I swapped the birthday cake and the balloon. Emoji also tend to be context sensitive. So I can wish you a happy birthday on your birthday, but we also have a sense of what happy and birthday mean independent of context, whereas the wrapped gift could be, depending on the season, a birthday gift or a Christmas gift. The party popper means something vaguely celebratory, but is more specifically contextually dependent. And then kind of standards of form, again, very similarly for the emoji. There's no necessary, you could have happy birthday without any of the emoji, or you could have them in any combination. You could sub out the party popper for a champagne bottle. So we go into this in a lot more detail. I don't always, it's more fun to kind of look at specific examples, but we can see that emoji already don't have a lot of those hierarchical combinatoric features of language. Some people have proposed that emoji could, and you find it in such a small number of examples that it kind of shows just how little people use it that way. So Cher is a wonderfully amazing, unique human, even in her emoji use. She's one of the few people I regularly see use emoji as a rebus. So she'll use the be character to represent the verb form be. But is kind of, by looking at these unique examples, we realize that people are very rarely using emoji in this way. So emoji don't have the same grammatical properties as human languages, spoken or signed, but they do have features similar to gesture. And in fact, we can map the functions of different emoji onto existing gesture categories. The range of categories of gesture is a hotly contested topic. It's something I have been researching around the edges of for the last 13 years. I know there's a lot of contestation about the formal properties of gestures within a particular category and the functional features that typify particular uses of gesture. I don't deny that that's true, and I will happily talk about that at length, but we took some of the most classic and generally agreed upon categories of gesture, mostly drawn, for those of you familiar with the gesture literature, from the work of David McNeill and Adam Kendon, and we looked at how different functions of emojis fit within those categories. The first is emblematic gestures, and emblematic gestures are a little bit different to the other kinds of gestures that occur with speech, in that they tend to be more nameable and quotable, and they do have some of those features of being well formed. So giving you a thumbs up is very different to raising my pinky finger. And I certainly won't raise other fingers in front of you all on camera, because raising each individual finger has an amount of well-formedness, and it has a particular meaning. Those meanings tend to be for particular cultural areas, although things like the thumbs up, I think, are increasingly used across a larger kind of human communication area, thanks to things like likes on the internet. But emblematic gestures are a really great place to start, partly because we do have emoji that you can evoke by name, and a lot of those are human hand gestures. So things like the thumbs up, the thank you hands, often also referred to as prayer hands. We have various emoji that you can evoke by name, things that are, the human body, and that we've kind of conveniently borrowed from our gestural repertoire because they are so handy. The shrug emoji, the eye roll, a wink, that have that emblematic meaning. But we've also taken a bunch of others, like face with tears of joy has a particular emblematic function that is not necessarily representative of what we would exactly do in a situation. I often use it for situations where I'm mildly amused, not actually weeping with amusement. Things like heart, the 100 emoji has a very fixed function, where one of the features of emblematic gestures or nameable gestures is that we can often use them alongside speech to clarify our intent. And we see the same with emoji. I can send the same text, I can say good job, and depending on what emoji I use with it, I could be highly amused, I could be greatly pleased, I could be very actually sarcastic and unimpressed thanks to the eye roll gesture. I can be giving a thumbs up and kind of pleased with it. The winky face and the blowing a kiss and the middle finger all give a different pragmatic interpretation, and emblematic gestures are often referred to as pragmatic gestures as well, because they have this effect of changing the communicative intent of an utterance in a way that we really miss out on in text a lot of the time. And we use other things. This is not to say emoji are single-handedly doing this. I could convey some of this intonational pragmatic value as well through things like punctuation or creative use of case. So, a full stop at the end of a short text message might be sent by one person as just, I finished a sentence, I'm using my standard written punctuation, whereas someone who is more attuned to informal online communication will see that as very blunt and very rude. And so two people using the same punctuation in different ways can create a miscommunication. But we can use punctuation and emoji. It's not that emoji are single-handedly doing all of this work. The next category of gestures are iconic or illustrative gestures. These are used to depict the entity that you're talking about. I'm just going to show you some examples of iconic gestures, but in the article we also talk about metaphoric as well. So iconic represents something concrete. So I can talk about, the giant piece of cake that I ate for lunch. But I could also talk about this really great idea that I have, and I can kind of talk about sharing this idea with you. I'm not talking about sharing my cake with you because I'm maybe very rude there and you're all too socially distant, but ideas and cake can actually have similar iconic or similar gestural properties. It's just that for a cake, there really was a physical piece of cake, and for an idea, we're using a metaphor to convey our gestures. And there are some metaphoric uses of emblems, but we also see iconic or illustrative uses of gesture. And these are to kind of speak to what is being depicted in the topic. So for birthdays, you get birthday relevant illustrative gestures. And, you know, I can talk about cake, but when it's a birthday, I can use illustrative emoji to represent that. I can use the drinks emojis when talking about the topic of drinks. And it's a way of further enriching and adding more communicative dimensions to the topic that is being referred to, in a way that, you know, obviously we can communicate verbally without seeing each other's gestures, thankfully. Otherwise the telephone would have been a dreadful invention and we would have all had to wait for video conferencing, and no one seems to like that very much. So we can communicate through just the spoken channel, but you miss out on a richness and an additional channel of information when we don't look at people's gestures. In the same way that you could convey happy birthday or ask someone to get a drink with you through just using text, but emoji add another layer of information, confirming, I guess, whether someone's referring to Friday night drink at the bar or a cup of tea or coffee. The emoji provide that additional communicative channel. Our next category is diactic gestures, also known as pointing. I am not going to spend too much time on this, not because gestures and pointing gestures are necessarily simple, but because the week on diactic gestures, when I teach our language and gesture subject here at La Trobe, I always just spend a lot of time pointing out to students how amazing it is that the human brain can figure out what's happening when you extend a finger, or you extend your gaze, or you use some other body part to indicate some direction, and the person knows to not just look at the end of your finger, but to draw an imaginary line from that finger to some focal point that you can then both pay attention to. And it's a wildly complicated cognitive thing. It takes until the later half of your first year of existence to even particularly be able to do it at all, if not well. It's something that not even some higher order primates and some other intelligent mammals can do very well. But it's something that's very flexible and very powerful in the human repertoire. And so it's no surprise that when it comes to pointing, it's one of the few emoji where you have exactly the same emoji, just in different orientation variants, because the flexibility of being able to use a human finger or an arrow to point is incredibly powerful and shows how people think about the physical context that they're using emoji in. People also have used, I've seen the eye roll emoji used as a look at this thing up here. And we have the side eye eyes as well. This is great. Although we've encoded the index fingers as pointing fingers, index finger is by no means a universal pointing mechanism across human cultures. There are a variety of different hand shapes people will use to point, but there are also communities where you have, for example, in Lao, you have a lot of pointing with the lips, and communities where you point with the eyes. So a very flexible set of gestures, or a very flexible set of gestures, a very flexible set of emoji there, even though there aren't that many, they're used very flexibly and powerfully. And I'll return to that point at the end of the talk. The next category are beat gestures. And this is where you, well, this is where you will never be able to look at a speech by a politician ever again. I'm very sorry. Beat gestures are those gestures that align with the contours of the speech prosody. So often used for emphasis. This is a good time to point out that although we have these gestures categories, they're not all mutually exclusive. So you could use an emblematic hand shape or a pointing hand shape with a beat form, which is that repetition. So you could say something like, I told you to look over there, and you've got that beat repetition with another category. So it's a good time to kind of remember that gesture categories aren't mutually exclusive, and beat gestures, you'll often see them used, especially during public discourse. They're very good at helping you maintain narrative coherence, which is very good when you're kind of talking on your feet. They're pretty ubiquitous for something we may not have thought about before. They turn up a lot. And working on looking at beat gestures helped Gretchen and I made sense of something kind of interesting that helps, again, show why emoji are less language-like and more gesture-like, which is that when you look at a corpus of, say, English, word repetition is very low. You get, for example, in Croker, the corpus of contemporary, I guess that's the American corpus, like far fewer than 0.1% of words are repetition. They're possible, but they're rare. And you definitely don't get more than, say, one repetition. If you look at emoji, on the other hand, this is a data set that Gretchen put together with some data from the team at SwiftKey. When you look at the repetition in emoji engrams, and this is a few years ago, but Face with Tears of Joy is still absolutely right up there, as are most of these actually. You just see a very high level of repetition. Just to completely digress for a second though, because I think there's also another beautiful story in here. The thing that makes me really happy about this data is just how much happiness there are in the top emoji that we use. We send each other a lot of happy emoji, and I think that says something very nice about how we use informal online communication. There's lots of happiness, but even more importantly, there's lots of repetition. We have some more from deep down in this data, and you really have to get to the bottom end of the kind of top 100 emoji bigrams and trigrams to start seeing things that aren't repetition. And then most of what you see there is a lot of, for example, a really good example is bigram number 10 there, where you have heart eyes and then blowing a kiss. So even when you move away from direct repetition, you still get, for example, a range of different colored hearts. So there's still a lot of internal repetition within that. And so we argue that emoji strings operate like beats because a beat emphasizes through repetition, and so does a string of emoji. Sending one party popper, sure, that's fine, but sending multiple party poppers is far more emphatic. And so you're using repetition and rhythm to create stronger emphasis. And with the hand clap emoji, people have certainly kind of used this directly in the way that you see, especially from the kind of speech of African American women, the use of hand claps as an emphatic tool. People have taken that directly into emoji use. So that's a kind of overview of why emoji don't have the same structural properties as language, and also an introduction to the major categories of gesture and how communicative functions of emoji have really clear parallels. We think there are a lot of benefits to taking this analysis of emoji, and I should say that we're certainly not the first people to suggest that emoji have gestural properties, but often people have looked at emoji as having a range of functions that are, intonational and or gestural, whereas we have made the first sustained case, really heavily drawing on some of the canonical gesture literature to look at why an analysis that they are like gesture is really fruitful. And we think it's fruitful for a number of reasons. The first is that you're returning multimodality to written language. I have made the argument before that I think emoji are the most exciting things to happen to writing since we stopped making illuminated manuscripts. And there's certainly a case to be made that they are helping us bring the full human face-to-face experience. Although we can't replicate that entirely in writing, emoji are about as close as we're going to get to that. And so in thinking about emoji in this way, it can help us map out the future of how we might look at and think about emoji. So what we know from gesture is that the hands are incredibly flexible, and anything that isn't overly specific has the opportunity to be used more flexibly by people. And so encoding, although it's lovely that there is now, what did we get? We got a polar bear and a beetle, and it's great that we have a couple of kinds of dinosaurs, but it's already pretty unwieldy sometimes to navigate through the full stock of emoji. And if we continue to focus on encoding every single object out there as an emoji, it's probably not going to be as communicatively flexible as focusing on things like emblematic repertoires that people have. So thinking about emoji from the perspective of gesture allows us to think more critically about where emoji might head. As I said, we don't think emoji are the only strategy people have to bring more multimodality to written language. There's obviously punctuation, but we would love to look further at how people are using things like GIFs, short animation images, things like stickers. Particularly now, there's a whole range of really great emoji combinatorics that are happening. So if you've opened up one of your messaging apps lately and you've selected an emoji, it will automatically generate some variations. If you want to distract yourself from life for 10 minutes later today, I can recommend going to emoji.kitchen, which is an online platform that lets you mash together different emoji, and then you can save the image you created and share it. You can't share it in line with the text though. This is the challenge with stickers and GIFs. As I said, they're not on the same line as the font, which makes emoji particularly flexible and powerful, but I still think it's a really exciting and interesting direction to be heading in. And of course, we are now all becoming experts in the perils and challenges and delights of online chat interfaces, whether that's something that is audio and video based like Zoom or something that is text based. But I think, again, thinking about making written and making online language more multimodal is a really exciting direction to go in. And of course, that's the kind of practical benefits I'm interested in. And there are benefits for research as well. So thinking about the functions of emoji, thinking about the functions of gestures, Emoji give us a new reason to revisit gesture categorization, which is always a topic I'm happy to discuss. So there's some of the beneficial effects of focusing on emoji as gesture. In terms of my current and ongoing work in this area, Gretchen and I realized that after doing this research, we kind of had to put our money where our mouth was, or at least our words where our aspirations were, and we've submitted some emoji proposals to Unicode. One of those is currently on Unicode's provisional list. It is this guy, the raised pinky. One of the benefits, as I said, about using hand shapes is that they are incredibly flexible. And so this hand shape might have meaning in one particular culture. It might mean fancy. If you're in India, it can be a polite way of asking where the bathroom is. And so this is an incredibly flexible, by encoding just one emoji, you can get a range of different meanings for different people. I'm also working with some of the Unicode crew in general to think more about the long-term direction of where the hand shape emoji are heading. So really trying to make some practical application out of all of the analysis that we've done. I am also interested in a better cross-cultural understanding of those emblematic gestures. This image here with the number 16 is part of a study from the late 1970s, where there was an incredibly wide survey of people in Europe. And that is the last time we've had anything that's looked like a large-scale systematic study of emblematic gestures, which means that we're losing a lot of opportunity to study the kind of breadth of variation in gesture, hand shape, and meaningful gestures across different cultures, which, as the internet continues to expand and people continue to kind of converge in emoji use and online graphic use, we're potentially losing the opportunity to look at this cultural variation. And my other gesture work, of course, is looking at the use of gestures among the Shuba and Yolmo communities, which are two Tibeto-Burman languages that are spoken in Nepal. I've been building a language documentation corpus with these communities for the last 10 years or so, and have been looking lately at a variety of gestures they use, again, really trying to bring a larger cultural perspective to gesture repertoires and how we use gesture to communicate. So as a summary of today's talk, letters let us write words, emoji let us write gestures. There are a few references here, but there are slides up at this bit.ly link. I will tweet them later. I will send them to the Eventbrite list. Thank you all very much for your time. I'm going to minimize this and bring us back into Zoom so that if you have any questions, I would love to maybe see them in the chat, or if we don't have that many, maybe you can pop up on video or audio and ask them. Thank you very much for your time. I've got one here from Alex M, who has asked, do I think that miscommunication occurs between different groups of emoji users, as in my example with the full stop? I absolutely think that it does. I will give you a couple of short examples. There's a really lovely paper about the grimace emoji, which looked like a look of concern on a couple of platforms for a while, and a look of anger from some other people. And that meant that if you sent your message from an Android to an Apple user, they would take a completely different pragmatic implication from that. And that has been rectified. I think the platforms are now very aware of this. Jeremy Burge, who runs Emojipedia, talked about 2018 being the year of emoji convergence. So I think platforms are now incredibly aware of how much people use emoji, and they keep in mind when designing them to try and make it as consistent as possible. The other example that I have is that my mother occasionally sends the crying face instead of face with tears of joy. And it's very unnerving for me when I think that she's devastated and then I realize that she was just being funny. So that is two examples, but I definitely think platforms are now very aware of the potential for confusion. And I think just like with emblematic gestures, we have cultural variation in how much of particular emoji use. You see some emoji used with great frequency in some areas where you don't see it used as much in others. Just Amy has asked, do I think if emoji has the potential to replace written language? I think there's a really nifty way of thinking about this, which is that gestures have a way of replacing language, and they do that by becoming sign language. And when, not to say that, you know, signed languages definitely arose out of gesture or anything, but you have a continuum between completely spontaneous co-speech gestures that have all of those, you know, spontaneous global meanings, and then by time you get over to signed languages, you have all of those linguistic properties in that table. So signed languages, like all languages, have the ability to break down into smaller parts. They have stability of form. You definitely mean a different word if you change, for example, the orientation of your hand while making a particular sign. And so for the manual mode to be linguistic, it absolutely can and is. For emoji to be a language, you would essentially be doing something like mapping particular emoji onto phonemes, which is how hieroglyphs ended up being used efficiently. And then it would be relying on all those structures of form. So there is a way for it to happen. I just don't think it's going to happen because we already successfully have good written languages. So, but if you'd like to create your own emoji rebus set, it's a fun way to entertain yourself. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I have one from James. It occurs to me that emoji overlap with manual gestures and with facial expressions. Should we be looking at the two separately? It's a good question. I drive my students crazy every year in language and gesture by talking about how the categories of what counts as particular categories of gesture are very much dependent on context. I think that in some situations, facial expressions are very much used emblematically with fixed meanings. I think there are some facial expressions that may be more kind of reflexive, automatic reactions. And so what facial gestures we've chosen to encode as emoji says a lot about how emblematic they are. And I don't think ignoring one and just focusing on the other gives us the full range of potential usefulness, really. Kind of interested in looking at all the things, which gets me into trouble sometimes. But again, there are cross-cultural variations in the meaning of particular facial expressions. And I don't know if we've always been as good at mapping those either. I have a question. I have a bunch of questions. I'll try and get through as many of them as I can. From Hannah, like all language, emoji semantics / pragmatics are very fluid, and certain emoji have shown a complete switch from their intended meaning to the exact opposite. Have I noticed a group of trendsetters or trendsetter groups for this? I have not done any research on this, but if I were putting money on it, I would absolutely say young people setting a tone for this. I think it's great that a lot of emoji are moving into a sarcastic use, because it shows that emoji, like many communicative things, kind of get used and then get tarnished by use, and then almost like the euphemism treadmill for spoken language. They move through kind of communicative functional lifespans. And it will be interesting to see. We have some great emoji lexicographers, like Jane Solomon does some of the best and most thoughtful work on this. You now have emoji entering dictionaries, particularly iconic ones like Face with Tears of Joy, that have a unique function beyond their direct iconic representation. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to track these uses. And if and when we do get a corpus and we do look at it, I will put money on the young people leading that charge. Faith Myers has asked, any thoughts on how exactly emoji develops specifically, widely accepted meanings over time, example, the 100 emoji? Networks are super powerful in communication and transmission of meaning. And I think, like, I definitely remember acquiring the 100 emoji. I didn't really know what it was, and actually learned, oh, people are using it in this way. So our networks are always more powerful than we give them credit for. And we're all learning new words all the time and learning new emoji as well. Do members of the deaf / hard of hearing community use emojis differently? That's from Carolyn. I do not know, but I would love to know. And that sounds like a really great question. If anyone is a member of these communities and has feelings about it, I'd like to know. But there's a great opportunity to do corpus work with things like emoji and with internet language in general. It's Gretchen makes a case for this, I think, pretty compellingly in because you have people being very spontaneous, very informal, but you're not necessarily creating the observer paradox if you were trying to observe people use language. I mean, I think there's definitely a need to still think deeply about the ethics of how we work online, but there's really great potential for research questions like that one. Why aren't there rude gestures in emoji? From Chuati. That may be your platform. Some of the platforms don't include the middle finger emoji. Some of them do. And I think there's a general consensus that they are not including rude gestures in emoji. I think I've seen at least one proposal for the Italian fig gesture. And they don't seem to get up, I think, because there's a general consensus on the platforms in the same way that they turned the gun into a water pistol. They're kind of always going for a relatively conservative function. Vijaya Kumar asked, why do we reiterate emoji? That would be the beat function, which is for emphasis. So if I think something is funny, I might use the tears of joy. If I think something is really funny, then the easiest way to say that is to use that 3 times. And again, much like some emoji are used sarcastically, I think something like the tears of joy and lol in general, you know, I don't laugh out loud when I use lol, and now I use it in lower caps. we may have to come up with an even more absurd amusement emoji, because we now have to use tears of joy on repetition to really enforce that we find something funny. From Jonathan Lum. Hi, Jonathan. Could I comment a little on the history of emoji? Yeah, sure. It's worth distinguishing between emoji and emoticons, I think, because MSN Messenger had emoticons in the late 90s. Emoji aren't the first way to create inline expression. We could use colons and parentheses to create smiley faces, and have done so for many decades. So in the kind of Jurassic Park life finds a way sentiment, I would say that people will always try and find a way to bring emotion and tone into writing, because writing is not adequate to express the fullness of being human, especially in an informal context. What makes emoji particularly flexible is their cross-platformness. So I can send a smiley face emoticon to you, that's true, but I can't send something like a polar bear, which we have now, or a bagel. I can send it from my phone, and I know as long as your phone is at least roughly the same age, that I will be able to send it to you and you will be able to see it. And so it's that cross-platform flexibility and ubiquity, which is why emoji have taken off, and particular emoji have gained the popularity that they've gained in a way that emoticons that were in MSN Messenger are just for MSN Messenger, or the little Skype animations that you use are just for that Skype platform. And so it's part of that flexibility that makes them so powerful. It's 5:02. If you have to go to your next meeting, I will let you go. I'm happy to stay around for a little bit and answer questions, as long as I don't have to go tend to a screaming toddler. But if you have to go now, thank you so much for coming today. It's been lovely to have you all here. Charlie Whitaker, hi Charlie, has asked, do I think that text communication platforms in which emoji aren't present limit people's ability to communicate? It just constrains it in different ways. Yeah, I think I like using emoji, and I think if I went back to using an old phone without them, I would have to think again about how to convey certain things. I mean, any medium we communicate in affects the way that we talk. James, again, this is turning into a conversation. Excellent. Phonology, the concept of the minimal word. A word must contain at least 2 syllables. One emoji on its own seems inadequate. Okay, so this is repetition in emoji. James is proposing a phonological theory, which I look forward to reading later. Do certain generations use more emoji than another? I find my mum uses emoji more than I do. I think there are potentially generational differences. Again, would make a great corpus study. So many great honours level research projects on these. Whether that's frequency or particular functions, you will probably find some effects of the networks that you use emoji with. There are some arguments about the function of emoji versus emoticons. I haven't seen anything lately, but I think there is some. There was a paper recently about Chinese text messages and the kind of use of emoji and GIFs and stickers and this kind of bricolage approach to using a variety of different communicative devices within a single communication. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's a pragmatic difference between using a smile emoticon and a smiling emoji. Well-formedness in terms of spacing and placement of emoji relative to text. Yeah, it would be good. Thank you, Rebecca, for this question. It would be good to get more data on how emoji can split up an utterance. And obviously one of the obvious differences between emoji and gestures that I didn't mention is that gestures can actually happen in direct parallel with speech, whereas we tend to get the written phrase and then the emoji as a kind of additional response to the original phrase. So it would be good to have more of a look at that relationship for sure. Just in case we do all get dumped out exactly on the hour, thank you all for coming. Thank you for all of your questions. I think that's all the questions from people. So thank you for coming.
Thanks, Lauren. Just mention to everybody that I think we had people from 12 countries here, from 5 continents, and would cover all of them if we included the fact that Esther, who is from Ghana, is actually in Australia at the moment. So this is a very, Bosnia as well. Sorry, I didn't see that. So that makes it 13. So that's quite marvelous. And we have recorded this and it will be available in due course.
It's probably more relevant for people who were not here.
Probably.
If you have any more questions, you're welcome to tweet them at me. I'll try and reply over the next little bit.
I will just mention for our regular seminar attenders that the next La Trobe seminar is expected to be in 3 weeks' time. It's on the topic of English in Malaysia and Brunei, and I'll be sending out a notice about that. Might be 4 weeks actually. I'll be sending out a notice about that to everyone in due course.
Thank you, Stephen, for organising the seminar. I'm going to, I feel really abandoned